Dr. Miller here with the book review. A book I think you find very interesting, no matter what age you are. Certainly if you're younger, you might not see the value in it as much, but I would encourage you to read it. There's a lot of books out there in this particular genre of wellness and longevity, but this is, I was really impressed with this book. It's called Outlive by Dr. Peter Attia, and I'll get into it a little bit more. But first, before I do, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subs, mostly for my ego. Let's be honest. What you'll get out of it is more videos, and I'll get out of it, according to what I've seen on YouTube anyway, Lamborghini, washboard abs, all of a sudden be very well tanned, and live in a house where there's an indoor pool and a lot of palm trees. So anyway, so if you can make that happen, I'd appreciate it. Be sure to like this video, and if you don't like it, you can down-like it as well. So let's get into this book review. So again, it's been in the wellness space for a long time, and as exercise physiologist, as somebody who's been in exercise science for a very long time, I tend to avoid these books, I'll be honest with you, just because they're kind of rehashing a lot of the same things over and over again that I end up teaching and talking about. And this book does the same. But what I appreciated is Dr. Attia, if you haven't heard of him, I saw him on a Jordan Peterson podcast snippet. And I thought, whenever somebody's making the rounds, selling a book or something, I'm interested. And so picked up the book and went through it. But what I appreciated is his perspective. A lot of times when these books are written, they might be written by somebody like myself, or maybe more somebody who's a little bit even more specialized. They're a doctor or they're a personal trainer or whatever it is. They don't have this kind of holistic look of things. Dr. Attia was an oncologist. Before that, he was more interested in engineering, it sounds like, but he went into oncology. Walked away from that when he realized that he was maybe on the wrong end of the situation. So as an oncologist, you're already getting people who have cancer. What if you could do something about that, the preventative side, before somebody got cancer? But then went into the risk management world and business world. And what was going on there, I think what happens to a lot of people who do big things, he was becoming a generalist. So he's taking specialized skills and then extending them to other fields, and then realizing how pulling back into that field can be beneficial. So he went from modern medicine to the business world and risk management, and then found back to kind of modern medicine, preventative health type of thing, and he's been able to merge these two things. I think that's part of his strength in what he's trying to do in maximizing longevity, is that he's become a little bit more of a generalist. I think if he would have just written the book as an oncologist, it wouldn't be as good of a book. I probably wouldn't have picked it up, to be honest with you. And he probably wouldn't be as popular as he is now. He has a podcast called The Drive. I've seen an episode of it, at least one of them. Seeing the guest list, it's people that I've spent some time listening to. Listened to one with Dr. Galpin, somebody that's a well-known exercise scientist, in the big world of fitness. So anyway, let's talk about some of the highlights. Obviously, I can't cover every single thing in this book. You got to read it. But the thing that I was really kind of hooked me on the book was the beginning portion. He does have a magic kind of bullet, rapamycin. This idea of that of taking that could extend life, and I don't know if I fully bought into that. I think there's some, to me, at least on the surface, I haven't really looked into it closely, so kind of understand that as, this idea of not being bigger. The smaller you are, the longer you live. There's some truth to that. But the method of using rapamycin, if you're not familiar, basically it's slow growth. Well, we don't want to do that necessarily in skeletal muscle. And anyway, I'll leave that part aside. I disagree with that. I have one other critique as well that I'll offer at the end, is more philosophical. But what he does talk about with his background in medicine and kind of looking at the research literature, is the idea of that there was medicine 2.0. Modern medicine is really good at fixing people with an acute problem, torn ACL, his experience in emergency rooms, gunshot wounds, things like that. Modern medicine is very good at that. Preventing, helping to keep from infection from killing somebody, etc. Medicine 2.0, basically modern medicine, is not good at the preventative side. Everything's a prescription. If you can't put a medical code to it, it's not going to get done. And so what we're seeing is we're getting to the strength of medicine 2.0, which is somebody already has type 2 diabetes, somebody already has cardiovascular disease. Dr. Attia talks about the 4 horsemen, right? The big killers, at least in the Western world: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, and then cognitive disease like Alzheimer's. Then he kind of talked about suicide as well. Unfortunately, is a rising cause of death. But he does a nice job of looking at medicine 2.0 and looking at its weaknesses. And some of it, which is what hooked me, was the research. His understanding and he's an intelligent dude, obviously, of seeing evidence-based practice, this idea of evidence-based practice. So we take the mean of a study, you know, like you take 100 people and what's the average response of something, preventative measures, say exercise or something, but we don't take into account all the time is the error bars. I'm big into error bars. Like we tend to ignore those, right? The standard deviation. You know, if the effect was an average of, you know, was 0 and then it went up to 50, but then that's the average effect. But then there was error bars that were plus or minus 25. That means whatever that intervention was, people really didn't respond well to it, and some really responded well to it. So it's pointing to this individual kind of approach. You know, I think he does a good job of citing these examples of, you know, somebody, these people that live into 100 years old, centenarians. You know, they drink whiskey and smoke cigarettes, and they live to 100. Why is that? Well, they won the genetic lottery to some degree. But there may be some other things there, but a lot of it was genetic. So there's just personal things that somebody may be more prone to type 2 diabetes. You know, I'm fair-skinned. I'm more, in my family history, I'm more likely to get melanoma, right? Skin cancer. I mean, it's just those things I think we understand, but Medicine 2.0 kind of takes this blanket approach. And so he talks, instead of evidence-based practice, right, is instead of just being anchored to those means, is more of an evidence-guided practice, right? So we can take that mean and say, okay, could be a direction, but let's actually test it. And you know, as a coach, I think I'm a generalist too. Maybe that's why I like this book as well. I can see the same type of thing as, okay, well, I can read a research literature, an original research study, and then extend it to some athletes, but some of them don't respond to it very well, and others do. It could be a study in men, and then I'm trying to apply it to women, or vice versa, and it doesn't work out because men and women have different physiology, right? So I appreciated that book. That's what really got me interested. I'm like, okay, this is a guy who really understands the limitations of our kind of reductionistic modern scientific approach, while not discounting some of its benefits, but certainly there's a lot of limitations to it. So, but he goes through the 4 horsemen and addresses each one of them, how preventative each one of these diseases are. I think he frames it nicely. This idea of longevity is just how long you live. Like, we're really good at trying to extend people's lifespan, but what is the quality of life like? So he talks about health span. You know, the ideal life would be, and I agree with him on this, you know, you go to 80 years old and then you die within 6 months, whatever the issue is, as opposed to you live into your 70 and then you have a decade of life that is miserable. You know, you're in frequent pain, you're isolated, you know, you're struggling with some sort of metabolic disease or whatever it may be. And so he does a good job of, you know, he frames it in the end, his kind of application is this, you know, this approach of picking 10 activities that you'd like to be able to do when you're, you know, in your 80s, and starting to train for those now, which I think is a really good approach. As a training and diet coach over the years, in athletics, you know, I would say maybe 10% of people that I've trained over the years have longevity and health as their ultimate outcome. It's usually, I want washboard abs, I want to look good, or I'm trying to compete for a sport. And those are great things, but probably more so because as we age, right, we start to think about those things a little bit more. Where most of the individuals that I've worked with over the years were younger athletes, you know, middle-aged folks that were athletes, or they're just trying to regain a body they had when they were 20. I have had the privilege over the years, though, of working in that 10%, usually older adults. I've worked with some 7-year-old. I had a group of 7-year-old ladies that were probably some of my favorite people to train. You know, a guy in his 80s that ran up the beach at Omaha in World War II. I mean, if you know anything about history, you know, on day one, by the way, I'll save that for another video, but it was a very interesting conversation. But this man was fit at 86 years old. His wife actually hired me to help him in the gym, and he didn't need my help. He didn't want me there. He was very kind to entertain, you know, to humor me, but the man was very, very fit. And so, and he's 86 years old. So, Dr. Attia does a good job of framing this kind of limitations in the research literature of Medicine 2.0, and this move to a Medicine 3.0 where we'd be more aggressive with screening. Like, he was honest in that, you know, a lot of what we've done with cancer in terms of helping people that have had cancer. It's when somebody has stage 4 cancer, the rates of survival haven't gone up very much, depending on the cancer. And that would be better to start attacking cancer on the front end. Some cancers are more responsive to better diet and physical activity than others, it appears. Something we've known for a while, but also the screening, right? So like for me, I just mentioned skin cancer. doing a regular screening 6 months, or if I notice an unusual spot, going and extending things more internally too. And you're seeing a lot of these companies emerge, whether it's a blood test or a scan or whatever it is, to try to detect cancers early, and that obviously is a good thing. It's the difference between stage 2 and stage 4. Stage 2 is usually completely recoverable. Stage 4 is typically fatal. Because the cancer is metastasized. So he does a good job of framing these things. I don't think he overextends himself to say exercise and diet fix everything. But when he attacks these 4 horsemen, he certainly frames the power of diet and exercise. Another part I really found value in is diet, his approach to dieting. Diet as a noun. I agree with him 100% here. The best diet you follow, the best diet you'll do is the one you follow. But understanding there might be some individual differences, right? That doesn't generate these kind of warring factions. And admittedly, I've been against fasting at one point and against keto. And over the years, I've kind of softened on these things. And the more I work with people, obviously, and realize, if the baseline is the typical Western diet, which is ultra processed foods and not very healthy, and if somebody wants to move to keto, that's going to be a far better diet for them than where they came from. And so that could be the place to start. If somebody wants to train a little harder, then they might need more carbohydrates, etc. But I agree with Dr. Attia on this, is that it's less about these diet wars. It's about finding what works, but maintaining some core principles, which is adequate protein intake, adequate vegetable and fruit intake. I mean, if you can do those 3 things really, really well, even if the meal timing and all these things aren't dialed in perfectly yet, certainly having protein every 5 hours is a good idea, right? That's optimal. But just trying to hit these daily markers of X amount of servings of fruits and vegetables, 3 to 6. Hitting your protein goals based on your body weight, or body mass, whatever one you want to follow. I mean, those are very powerful things. What I typically tell people, the things we do know comfortably about diet is eat the healthiest food that you have access to and eat as many fruits and vegetables as possible, right? And what I mean by that first part is that includes protein. Right? If you have access to a lot of protein, protein's expensive. If you can afford, try to eat as much protein close to that, 1.5 grams per kilo mark as possible, if not even up to 2.0, especially as we age. Getting higher protein is even more beneficial. So he does a nice job. And what he said about diet, and I kind of thought about this when I was reading the book, is that a bad diet, like you always say, you can't outtrain a bad diet. There's some truth to that. So, but diet is getting you to baseline. So if your diet is bad, quote unquote, unhealthy and bad, you need to get back to a healthy diet. But being more meticulous about the healthy diet may not provide you the great range or the rate of return as you think. So I'll frame this in, maybe you'll follow this, maybe you won't. The financial world, if you follow like Dave Ramsey's, getting out of debt, right? That's really good advice. If you're in debt, you've been doing poorly, and this is not financial advice, by the way, I'm just framing this. It's a good idea to get a budget and get yourself out of debt. But once you're out of debt, like Dave Ramsey's advice about never going into debt to buy a business, or right, maybe that's not great advice. Again, everybody's got a risk. Don't take this as my endorsement of taking on debt. But if it's debt to generate cash flow, then that requires, what I'm getting at is that requires a different mindset, right? And so kind of like diet will get you back to not being in debt. It'll get you to the point where you're healthy, right? But it may not, be more meticulous with it beyond that, and fighting over these different diet structures, and they may not generate you much return, right? You're going to need a different paradigm. And what I'm getting at, like the different paradigm here was I'm going to go in debt, but not to buy the latest car, but to buy business or something. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if that does, but so diet's effect is actually a little bit more limited than we think. And I would agree with that for like weight loss and the aesthetic stuff. Diet is clearly important. Controlling body fat, it's obviously a big player. But when it comes to longevity and health, health span, outside of what I just said about protein and fruits and vegetables, obviously refined sugar, things like that should be limited. But that falls in that ultra processed group, and that goes back to the first thing I said, which was eat the healthiest food that you have access to, financially, availability near you, etc. That usually takes care of itself, because in the Western world, you can get healthier food than ultra processed food. Maybe not all the time, but you can certainly move away from that. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. Hope that makes sense. I think the diet stuff is a little overrated outside of like the scale stuff. That's why it gets so much it's so much press is because it's related to weight loss. And weight loss is always heavily tied to health when it may not be as tightly tied as we think. And what I mean by that is like myself, maybe this is a personal bias, so maybe this is why this is, but the research that supports this is the bigger you are muscle mass wise and the stronger you are, that's going to extend lifespan. Like the whole t-shirt motto, right? Stronger people hard to kill. Well, there's some truth to that. So to say somebody's body weight is the only factor is a little bit short-sighted. We have to factor in body composition. So I don't want to go down that too far, but hopefully that makes sense. I appreciate it. It's not about the diet wars. It's when it comes to longevity and health span, it's more so about just hitting these basics. Because the research literature otherwise is all over the place. It's hard. The diet research, the nutrition research is hard to interpret because of the methodology, and that goes for any study. All right, so exercise he points to is probably the greatest factor in longevity and health span. And of course, I'm heavily biased because I'm an exercise physiologist, but I would agree with this 100%. That exercise has the most upside in terms of it. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily for weight loss, it's the most important thing. I would point to diet, so on that side. But when it comes to living longer, more fit, the more fit you are cardiovascularly, the stronger you are. I just mentioned before, you're going to live longer. And you could say, well, I knew somebody was fit and strong, and they died at 55, but they probably would have died at 45, right? I mean, it's relative to how Now, obviously, we're trying to look at people living into their 80s and 90s. Well, that's going to happen if somebody has better cardiovascular fitness and are stronger. I'm talking about muscular strength. So, and his citing of the literature to say the signal of the positive effective exercise for longevity is very strong. Where, like I just mentioned before, the nutrition literature can be a little bit messy. Like we can't figure out if eggs are a good idea, right? So, where exercise it's pretty clear that, and he does a good job of getting out of that war as well between which one's better, cardiovascular or strength. Well, again, because of, and I understand this because I'm in this realm too, because of the focus on aesthetics and getting shredded and all these things, weight training has kind of received this elevated, in the general fitness world, elevated place over cardiovascular conditioning. And while it is more effective for weight loss, failure to improve cardiovascular fitness or at least have a weight training program that also encourages some metabolic fatigue that builds cardiovascular fitness would be a mistake. When we're talking about longevity and health span, again, we have to untie this from getting shredded and being lean. We're talking about just longevity here. And so I think the book did a good job. The sleep section, absolutely critical. Overrated, because we're talking about stress management. I don't know how many clients I've worked with over the years that were doing everything well. And even athletes, diet, training program, sleep was off. Ability to recover from training is done. You could have a great training program and think, this training program's awful. But you're sleeping 5 hours a night, right? I won't go into all the details here, but that chapter alone is worth the read. We hear things all the time like eat better, exercise, and you need to make sure you sleep. But to actually sit down and look at the data and think about the implications of something like not getting enough sleep, it should motivate you, right? And that chapter is probably one of the most important in the book, in my opinion, because it's the most underrated of the factors he talked about. And he even mentioned that as well. Also talks about emotional health. At the end, he does a good job. He talked more about his own experience, which is probably a good idea, staying in your lane in that area, mental health, things like that. He talks about Alzheimer's as well, cognitive health, the importance of moving activity, mention of, involved in sports, not just straight line type of activities, but, it's where you have to react to things is actually a way of preserving cognitive health, and I would agree with that. That's a highlight in that section for me. But there was some really good stuff there that also exposed some of the limitations in the research literature. If you've seen any of the kind of fallout of the Alzheimer's research, and that that research has been pursuing the wrong pathway for a long time. This idea of tau and limiting all the tangles in the brain. The factors that we thought were doing that were not the factors, even though these things are observed. So it just shows you that the research literature, this idea of the last few years, follow the science. The science is fallible. You be very careful. When you be critical thinkers on our own, and be very careful. That's I think why I was attracted to this book, because I think Dr. Attia did a good job of talking about that. the research literature is not this holy writ that is infallible. And so we've seen this played out over and over again in history, and as another great example is Alzheimer's of kind of getting in the weeds and chasing rabbits down rabbit holes and wasted a lot of money and time. This also reminded me of a story when I was a grad student. There was a brilliant physiologist. He had a lab that was looking at these micro factors related to blood flow. And as I listened to these things and looked at the experiments, and they're very interesting, I kept thinking, well, this is what this is for, is trying to set up some sort of medical intervention or a pharmaceutical intervention, right? And I kept thinking over again, well, why don't we just exercise? Like, we know blood flow is very powerful, right? Which is a big theme in Dr. Attia's book. I would say that he kind of danced around, I don't think on purpose, but he was hitting it, is that blood flow is a very powerful thing. The more you push blood around, we've seen some research literature, the longer you live. I mean, that's supported by the research literature. But just kept thinking, all these, this is medicine 2.0, all these things, we can exercise in a pill form. The solution's actually pretty easy. You just got to exercise. By the way, Dr. Attia does a good job of, kind of working on that the limitations of that. When somebody says, go exercise, well, what does that mean? He provides some guidance there that I agree with most of it. So I won't go into details there, but you can read the book for that. But anyway, so he did a good job of hitting on these major wellness, these dimensions of wellness, and how that affects the whole person. And how you can be lacking in one or the other, and that could be limiting your longevity and your health span. And certainly the time to mental health and suicide potentially. Again, the web there of isolation and not being outside and not getting physical activity and not sleeping, all those things spin together. So good job of framing that. This is my critique. This is more philosophical. The one area he didn't really cover because of his worldview. There's the constant reference of Darwinian evolution throughout the book, and I struggle many times because in looking at Darwinian evolution, it's always presented as fact, and the data for Darwinian evolution is so flimsy. Like explaining, sleep, between a morning person and an evening person, a night owl, because of Darwinian evolution. Somebody needed to be awake at all times to watch for predators. I struggle with those citations throughout. Now, it's something you can ignore if you don't struggle with that, or you subscribe to Darwinian evolution, it won't bother you at all. But it was interesting because then, what has that worldview done? Darwinian evolution is a dominant worldview in the Western world anyway, is only about 150 years old, where it's really received a lot of traction. I couldn't help to think with the emotional health and his lack of talking about spiritual health, how much of an impact that's had on the wellness of a modern person, now postmodern Western person. The nihilism that tends to flow out of Darwinian evolution. I'm not saying everybody is nihilistic that follows Darwin evolution, but I just thought that was an interesting, as I was listening to this, like, okay, we're talking about, all these different realms. I kept thinking, why bother? Why bother doing any of this stuff and live longer if there's the meaning behind why we're living? I thought that was interesting. And then getting into emotional health and things like that. It's like, well, I think maybe there's an undercurrent. Again, it's more philosophical. You can disagree with me on this, put it in the comments. But if we follow Darwinian evolution, it kind of guts the meaning of life, right? If there's nothing outside of ourselves, then of course we're going to see a rise in some of these emotional and mental health issues that spin into the physical. I mean, that all ties together too, and I think that was a dimension that was missing. If that's not of interest to you, or you can put that aside and kind of, eat the meat and spit out the bones, so to speak. The book is excellent, and I do highly recommend it, especially tackling these areas I've talked about. That was my only critique, though, was kind of this philosophical, approach. So anyway, that's all I got. Again, the book's called Outlive by Dr. Peter Attia. He has I mentioned the podcast, The Drive. I don't know Dr. Attia. This is not an endorsement of him and everything he says or does. I just read the book. I saw one podcast episode. Seems like a guy that's fairly well balanced and trying to reasonably discuss some of these issues. And he's, of course, it was in my wheelhouse because he talked a lot about exercise physiology, and those things appealed to me as well, sports and those type of things. So anyway, check out the book. I'll see you guys in the next video. And again, like, subscribe, and let's chase those Lambo dreams together. 1,000 subs. I'll see you in the next video.